How to describe The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1934 in few words? Well, for starters, a lot of women use guns in this movie, which I think it's pretty avant-garde. It's pretty ruthless, and it's great to see, to be honest. And a lot of techniques that we see from Hitchcock are evident in this film. Did I mention the use of guns in this movie? Because yeah, there's a lot of guns. Guess it's pretty off gun. So let's discuss. At the time that The Man Who Knew Too Much releases, Hitchcock hasn't had a hit in 4 years since the Hitchcock talkies that we discussed in the last episode. Now, I feel like Hitchcock was probably doubting himself too much because the movies that I'm about to mention just don't fit with his style at all. And don't get me wrong, you can do different genres. I mean, Spielberg does it all the time and they still have the same Spielberg esque tone. But here it's just, it's weird because, okay, one of them is like a musical sketch comedy, another one is a drama about feuding families, and there's no murder. This one is just this one, but in German. There's a romance film and a comedy thriller that critics say it's more like a serious drama. And also, Hitchcock didn't want to do this film because he thought the book had too many cliches. And then there's a biofilm, all for a total of 6 movies in 4 years, which none were pretty successful. So yeah, The Man Who Knew Too Much is very important to Alfred Hitchcock's career. It not only reconnected him with his long style with Suspense, but since all of those other movies were low blows in his career, it kind of ignited the passion again and it rose him up to fame. Heck, it even got international appeal. It was the first movie of Hitchcock to make it into America, which would eventually get him the deal with Hollywood. Alright, so what is the film about? So, a vacationing family becomes friends with a man who is subsequently murdered, but not before he can pass the information that an assassination is going to take place. To keep the family from talking, a group of spies kidnap the daughter of the family, and subsequently they're going to do the murder of the famous politician in hand. So, inspiration of the movie, what's going on? Okay, so the movie is originally an adaptation of a novel by Hugh Drummond, but that deal fell through. So the plot was kept, but it eliminated some key elements of that story to not have problems and copyright demands. At the time, Hitchcock had bought the rights to a book collection called The Man Who Knew Too Much and Other Stories of 1922 by English writer J.K. Chesterton. It was basically a collection of detective stories. However, other than the fact that the collection contained detective and villain stories, there's not much correlation between the book collection and the movie. It just has the same title. However, this is what's going on. Hitchcock played with the story. He kept some of the elements of the Hugh Drummond book, but he got inspired by an actual England event and incorporated it into the script. Now, on January 1911, the siege of Sidney Street happened in England. It was a gunfight in the East End of London between a combined police and army force and two revolutionaries.
Everything started on a quiet night in the heart of London's East End, now home of hipsters, design hubs and trendy cafes. The spark for the siege of Sidney Street was lit. The Weil family, living in number 120 Houndsditch Road, reported suspicious hammering noises coming from number 119. That number was Mr. Harris's jewellery shop. It sounded like bricks being knocked down. Later, history revealed that it was the work of a gang of refugees from Russian Latvia, and, according to the legend, the gang's leader was Peter Piaktov, aka Peter the Painter. The police responded to the call, and several unarmed constables went to check out the scene. One of them decided to get inside the building, and he was fatally shot. The following hours saw an escalation of violence. In a crude battle on the street, 4 constables were killed by gunfire. The murders of the policemen caused outrage throughout Britain. On New Year's Day, 1911, an informant told the police that 2 members of the same gang were hiding at 100 Sidney Street. The famous siege was about to begin. The police organised a heavily armed operation to capture the criminals, expecting that they would find fierce resistance. By 2 o'clock in the morning of January 3rd, 200 men had cordoned off the block. Armed officers were posted in shops and buildings surrounding the house of the refugees.
So yeah, all of this checks out. Is basically kind of the same thing, like I mentioned, and he played around it in the movie and basically did a homage to this tragic event in England history and showcased it in his movie. So some historical context. All of the main cast of The Man Who Knew Too Much were survivors of the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919. It was basically the same as coronavirus. Right now, 15 million people died and it was super tragic. So Hitchcock and the entire adult cast of this movie were survivors of this deadly pandemic. Alright, so how does this movie connect to the Hitchcock verse, the Hitchcock universe? What's going on? How did this movie rose up his career? Okay, so we know that he uses a lot of voyeurism, which is the pleasure of looking at other things that you shouldn't be looking at. So yeah, that's something he likes to implement in his movies, and I noticed them watching the film. For instance, the scene of the shootout where everyone is outside watching the commotion kind of reminds me of that patio scene between Thorwald and Jeff in Rear Window, where everyone was outside looking and seeing what was going on. Now, another motif that Hitchcock uses in Rear Window and The Man Who Knew Too Much is that in that same scene of the patio scene from Rear Window minutes earlier, when Thorwald is intimidating Jeff and trying to harm him, Jeff uses the flash and he takes a bunch of pictures to stop and gain time so that he could call for help. Well, they kind of did something similar in The Man Who Knew Too Much at the dentist, when the investigator is pointing the light towards the door where the criminals would enter. So, overall thoughts on The Man Who Knew Too Much. I think that is one of his best early work. Like I mentioned, it cements what he would play with in other films. And it just reconnected him with this suspense passion that I think he had lost, or maybe horror and suspense didn't sell so much before, but nowadays people love a good scare, and I think it's been like that for a while. Maybe he came to his senses and he said, hey, this is my niche and I should make the best out of it. So yeah, It's not his best work, but it definitely cements what he would do later on. Then prepare for a mystery and a pursuit in a brand new episode of Master of Suspense.